Everything you need to know about African American origin, struggle for freedom, population, religion, and so on. Hello, Displorers! Welcome back to another informative video presented to you by Displorer, and thanks for watching. In this video, we shall be presenting to you everything you need to know about African Americans, their origin, struggles, population, religion, and more. But before we proceed, if you're new here, welcome. Be sure to subscribe and turn notifications so you don't miss any of our videos. Black Lives Matter protests have opened up conversations about the history of privilege, racism, and the life experiences and identities of black people in America. Now, the distinction between black and African American has become a prominent conversation on social media. Many people often default to African American, out of a desire for either political correctness or politeness. The two terms are often used interchangeably, but that isn't always accurate, and it's important to understand the nuance when discussing race in both America and on a global scale. African Americans, also referred to as Afro-Americans, are an ethnic group of Americans with total or partial ancestry from any black racial groups of Africa. The term African American generally denotes descendants of enslaved black people who are from the United States. Origin of African Americans. Before the transatlantic slave trade, slavery was already practiced in Africa. Slavery in historical Africa was practiced in many different forms: debt slavery, enslavement of war captives, military slavery, slavery for prostitution, and criminal slavery were all practiced in various parts of Africa. Slavery for domestic and court purposes was widespread throughout Africa. Plantation slavery also occurred, primarily on the eastern coast of Africa and in parts of West Africa. African American history starts in the 16th century, with black people from West and Central Africa forcibly taking as slaves to Latin America. Ship owners regarded slaves as cargo to be transported to the Americas as quickly and cheaply as possible, there to be sold to work on coffee, tobacco, cocoa, sugar, and cotton plantations, gold and silver mines, rice fields, the construction industry, cutting timber for ships in skilled labor, and as domestic servants. The first African slaves arrived through Santo Domingo to the San Miguel de Guadalupe colony, most likely located in the Winner Bay area of present-day South Carolina, founded by Spanish explorer Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon in 1526. The ill-fated colony almost immediately disrupted by a fight over leadership, during which the slaves revolted and fled to the colony to seek refuge among local Native Americans. De Ayllon and many other colonies died shortly afterwards of an epidemic, and the colony was abandoned. The settlers and slaves who had not escaped returned to Haiti, whence they had come. The marriage between Luisa de Abrego, a free black domestic servant from Seville, and Miguel Rodriguez, a white Segovian conquistador in 1565 in St. Augustine, Spanish Florida, is the first known and recorded Christian marriage anywhere in what is now the continental United States. In the United States began in 1619, when 20 Africans were landed in the English colony of Virginia. These individuals were not slaves, but indentured servants, persons bound to an employer for a limited number of years, as were many of the settlers of European descent. By the 1660s, large numbers of Africans were being brought into the English colonies. In 1790, blacks numbered almost 760,000 and made up nearly one-fifth of the population of the United States. Attempts to hold black servants beyond the normal term of indenture culminated in the legal establishment of black chattel slavery in Virginia in 1661 and in all the English colonies by 1750. Black people were easily distinguished by their skin color, the result of evolutionary pressures favoring the presence in the skin of a dark pigment called melanin in populations in equatorial climates, from the rest of the populace, making them highly visible targets for enslavement. The development of the belief that they were an inferior complex with a heathen culture made it easy for whites to rationalize black slavery. Enslaved blacks were put to work clearing and cultivating the farmlands of the New World. Of an estimated 10 million Africans brought to the Americas by slave trade, about 430,000 came to the territory of what is now the United States. The overwhelming majority were taken from the area of Western and Central Africa, stretching from present-day Senegal to Angola, where political and social organization as well as art, music, and dance were highly advanced. On or near the African coast had emerged the major kingdoms of Oyo, Ashanti, Benin, Dahomey, and the Congo. In the Sudanese interior had arisen the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, the Hausa states, and the states of Kanem Bornu. Such African cities as Djenné and Timbuktu, both now in Mali, were at one time major commercial and educational centers. With the increasing profitability of slavery and the slave trade, some Africans themselves sold captives to the European traders. The captured Africans were generally marched in chains to the coast and crowded into hordes of slave ships for the dreaded Middle Passage across the Atlantic Ocean, usually to the West Indies. Shock, disease, and suicide were responsible for the deaths of at least 1/6 during the crossing. In the West Indies, the survivors were seasoned, taught the rudiments of English, and drilled in the routines and discipline of plantation life. Slavery in the United States. Black slaves played a major, though unwilling and generally unrewarded, role in laying the economic foundations of the United States, especially in the South. Blacks also played a leading role in the development of the Southern speech, folklore, music, dancing, and food, blending the cultural traits of the African homelands with those of Europe. During the 17th and 18th centuries, African and African-American slaves worked mainly in the tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations of the southern seaboard. Eventually, slavery became rooted in the South's huge cotton and sugar plantations. Although northern businessmen made great fortunes from the slave trade and from investments in southern plantations, slavery was never widespread in the North. Crispus Attucks, a former slave killed in the Boston Massacre of 1770, was the first martyr to the cause of American independence from Great Britain. During the American Revolution, some 5,000 black soldiers and sailors fought on the American side. After the Revolution, some slaves, particularly former soldiers, in the northern states abolished slavery. But with the ratification of the Constitution of the United States in 1788, slavery became more firmly entrenched than ever in the South. The Constitution counted a slave as 3/5 of a person for purposes of taxation and representation in Congress, thus increasing the number of representatives from slave states, prohibited Congress from abolishing the African slave trade before 1808, and provided the return of fugitive slaves to their owners. In 1807, President Thomas Jefferson signed legislation that officially ended the African slave trade beginning in January 1808. However, this act did not presage the end of slavery. Rather, it spurred the growth of domestic slave trade in the United States, especially as a source of labor for the new cotton lands in the southern interior. Increasingly, the supply of slaves came to be supplemented by the practice of slave breeding, in which women slaves were persuaded to conceive as early as the age of 13 and to give birth as often as possible. Laws known as the slave codes regulated the slave system to promote absolute control by the master and complete submission by the slave. Under these laws, the slave was chattel, a piece of property and a source of labor that could be bought and sold like an animal. The slave was allowed no stable family life and little privacy. Slaves were prohibited by law from learning to read or write. The meek slave received tokens of favor from the master, and the rebellious slave provoked brutal punishment. A social hierarchy among the plantation slaves also helped keep them divided. At the top were the house slaves, next in rank were the skilled artisans. At the bottom were the vast majority of field hands, who bore the brunt of the harsh plantation life. With this tight control, there were few successful slave revolts. Slave plots were invariably betrayed. The revolt led by Cato in Stone, South Carolina in 1739 took the lives of 30 whites. A slave revolt in New York City in 1741 caused heavy property damage. Some slave revolts, such as those of Gabriel Prosser, Richmond, Virginia in 1800, and Denmark Vesey, Charleston, South Carolina in 1822, were elaborately planned. The slave revolt that was perhaps most frightening to slave owners was the one led by Nat Turner, Southampton, Virginia in 1831. Before Turner and his co-conspirators were captured, they had killed about 60 whites. Individual resistance by slaves took such forms as mothers killing their unborn children to save them from slavery, the poisoning of slave owners, the destruction of machinery and crops, arson, malingering, and running away. Thousands of runaway slaves were led to freedom in the North and Canada, by black and white abolitionists who organized a network of secret routes and hiding places that came to be known as the Underground Railroad. One of the greatest heroes of the Underground Railroad was Harriet Tubman, a former slave who on numerous trips to the South helped hundreds of slaves escape to freedom. Free blacks and abolitionism. During the period of slavery, free blacks made up about 1/10 of the entire African American population. In 1860, there were almost 500,000 free African Americans, half in the South and half in the North. The free black population originated with former indentured servants and their descendants. It was augmented by free black immigrants from the West Indies and by blacks freed by individual slave owners. But free blacks were only technically free. In the South, where they posed a great threat to the institution of slavery, they suffered both in law and by custom of many restrictions imposed on slaves. In the North, free blacks were discriminated against in such rights as voting, property ownership, and freedom of movement, though they had some access to education and could organize. Free blacks also faced the danger of being kidnapped and enslaved. The earliest African American leaders emerged among the free blacks of the North, particularly those of Philadelphia, Boston, and New York City. Free African Americans in the North established their own institutions, churches, schools, and mutual aid societies. One of the first of these organizations was the African Methodist Episcopal (AME) Church, formed in 1816 and led by Bishop Richard Allen of Philadelphia. Among other noted free African Americans was the astronomer and mathematician Benjamin Banneker. Free blacks were among the first abolitionists. They included John B. Roseworm and Samuel E. Cornish, who in 1827 founded Freedom's Journal, the first African American run newspaper in the United States. Black support also permitted the founding and the survival of The Liberator, a journal begun in 1831 by the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison. Probably the most celebrated of all African American journals was the North Star, founded in 1847 by the former slave Frederick Douglass, who argued that the anti-slavery movement must be led by black people. Population. In 1790, when the first U.S. census was taken, Africans, including slaves and free people, numbered about 760,000, about 19.3% of the population. In 1860, at the start of the Civil War, the African American population had increased to 4.4 million, but the percentage rate dropped to 14% of the overall population of the country. The vast majority were slaves, with only 488,000 counted as free men. By 1900, the black population had doubled and reached 8.8 million. In 1910, about 90% of African Americans lived in the South. Large numbers began migrating north, looking for better job opportunities and living conditions, and to escape Jim Crow laws and racial violence. The Great Migration, as it was called, spanned the 1890s to the 1970s. From 1916 through the 1960s, more than 6 million black people moved north, but in the 1970s and 1980s, that trend reversed, with more African Americans moving south to the Sun Belt than leaving it. Today, the population of African Americans is estimated at 47.1 million people. When it comes to religion, the majority of African Americans are Protestant, many of whom follow the historically black churches. The term black church refers to churches which minister to predominantly African American congregations. Black congregations were first established by freed slaves at the end of the 17th century, and later when slavery was abolished, more African Americans were allowed to create a unique form of Christianity that was culturally influenced by African spiritual traditions. According to a 2007 survey, more than half of the African American population are part of the historically black churches. The largest Protestant denomination among African Americans are the Baptists, distributed mainly in 4 denominations, the largest being the National Baptist Convention, USA, and the National Baptist Convention of America. The second largest are the Methodists. The largest denominations are the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. Pentecostals are distributed among several different religious bodies, with the Church of God in Christ as the largest among them by far. About 16% of African American Christians are members of white Protestant communions. These denominations, which include the United Church of Christ, mostly have 2 to 3% African American membership. There were also large numbers of Catholics, constituting 5% of the African American population. Of the total number of Jehovah's Witnesses, 22% are black. Some African Americans follow Islam. Historically, between 15 and 30% of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas were Muslims, but most of these Africans were converted to Christianity during the era of American slavery. During the 20th century, some African Americans converted to Islam, mainly through the influence of black nationalist groups that preached with distinctive Islamic practices, including the Moorish Science Temple of America and the largest organization, the Nation of Islam, founded in the 1930s. It attracted at least 20,000 people by 1963. Prominent members included activist Malcolm X and boxer Muhammad Ali. In recent years, lots of African Americans have started tracing their African roots and returning to Africa. There you have it, explorers. Thanks for watching this video. If you did enjoy, do well to give it a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe and share with your friends.